Today, we're going to talk through how to run an internal pen test using Horizon 3 and NodeZero. So when you think of an internal pen test, think of the attacker has just gained initial access into your network. Some employee has clicked and opened up a bad attachment on a particular laptop, or on that particular machine is where an insider threat is launching their attack, or that is the host where SolarWinds was installed that gave the attacker initial access. When you think of NodeZero, NodeZero is that unauthenticated access point for launching the attack. The first thing about NodeZero is it is a single-use Docker container that acts as that remote access Trojan or that launch of the insider threat attack. When we say we have no agents, and what we mean by this is there are no persistent credentialed agents you have to install and maintain in your network. NodeZero is a single-use container. At the end of the operation, that container will be deleted, or you can delete it. At the beginning of the operation, that container will get downloaded and installed and run. The other part is NodeZero runs as an unauthenticated user on the network. We don't want to cheat in any way. The most important question to ask is, if an attacker gained access to my network and they had zero privileges whatsoever, they were completely authenticated, what damage could they do? And what NodeZero will determine is ways to elevate its privileges to become a domain user where it can access data that the domain user has access to. NodeZero will find ways to elevate its privileges to become a domain administrator, in which case it has keys to the kingdom. The third important part of NodeZero is it requires external access via port 443 to Horizon 3's command and control services running in the cloud on AWS. The command and control service is where the brains of the pen test are occurring. In many ways, NodeZero is just a lightweight keystroke injection container that has no brains in it whatsoever. What it must do is connect to the command and control service, which runs as a dedicated virtual private cloud in AWS. It is dedicated to this specific operation. And at the end of the operation, that virtual private cloud will be destroyed. So there is no persistent on-prem or cloud infrastructure that you have to maintain or manage or secure in any way. We do not want to add to your attack surface, which is why we make these things single use. And at the end of the pen test, NodeZero can be deleted, or if you don't want to re-download it every time you run the pen test, you can leave the NodeZero container image itself running around, sitting around, even though it's not started and executing. So the second thing we're going to talk through is how to actually get NodeZero's requirements up and running. So NodeZero requires a Docker host running Linux. Now, if you're on a Windows machine, whether it's a Windows laptop or a Windows server, what that means is you need to install a hypervisor running Linux and Docker. NodeZero doesn't have any specific Linux requirements, so the latest version of Linux should be just fine. The specific versions that we know that we've used are available off the website, off the documentation. But once again, there are no specific requirements or features of Linux that NodeZero depends on. If you already have a Linux box, you have to make sure that Docker is installed. Docker Community Edition is good enough. If you want to run NodeZero off of your laptop, like Mac OS, then you can use Docker Desktop as that Linux host. But keep in mind that because of the security features within macOS and Docker, certain attack features like using Responder, which does man-in-the-middle hash collection, are not going to be usable. The next thing we're going to do is open a shell on that Docker host. So on my Mac, where I'm going to do this, what you need is shell access. And you've got to make sure that Docker Desktop is running. Step 4 here is you want to actually run a pen test from the Horizon 3 portal. So when you go into the portal, what you're going to find is this type of view, operations and the various ops that have been running. You should see a sample op in the console here, which it comes preloaded. So we want to actually run a pen test. So the first click is to run a pen test. Here, you can set various types of scopes. If you want to just take the defaults where NodeZero is going to execute from its initial location and is going to discover all assets that are reachable on the network, you can just let it run with an intelligence scope. If you want NodeZero to stay within a specific IP range, like 192.168.10/24, 192.168.00/24, you can explicitly define the scopes and subnets. If you want NodeZero to run a full RFC 1918 scope, so all of the private IPs for the 10 dots, the 172 dots, the 192 dots, this will take a little bit longer, but you will assess every single device on the private network. Because once again, this is an internal pen test. If you're running Mac OS with Docker Desktop, once again, the security features limit NodeZero's ability to actually discover scope. So if you want it to work well, you're going to have to explicitly define the custom scope in here. So for my house, it would be 192.168.00/24, 192.168.10/24. Now, once you've put in the scope, if you want to poke around, you can see there are additional configurations you can set. Open source intelligence means that you can provide your top level domains. NodeZero will attempt to do things like subdomain takeovers. You can put in your company name. NodeZero will connect to sources like LinkedIn in order to find user IDs, and it will try different passwords to do a credential attack. You can set up an advanced config if there are specific attacks or configs that you do not want to do. For instance, you're worried about locking out your users, so you don't want to do any sort of password spraying. But for the most part, what we've determined is these defaults are benign and safe to run in production. So now what you want to do is run. Now what's happening under the covers is NodeZero or the product is generating a launch script. Think of this script when you run it as no different than an employee opening up a bad attachment on this laptop. So this is almost like a malicious link. Or this is where the insider threat is going to launch their attack from, or this is where SolarWinds was installed, as I'd said earlier. So you want to take that script, copy it to clipboard, and if you remember the shell that we opened, you're going to paste it in and hit enter. So that's it. What's happening now is NodeZero is going to verify that the machine has the prereqs required to execute. Do you have the right OS installed? Do you have Docker running? Do you have enough memory? Do you have enough compute? If this is the first time you're executing NodeZero, then NodeZero will get downloaded. It's about a 10 gig file, so it could take 10 to 20 minutes, depending on your bandwidth. At the end of the operation, you can delete NodeZero. As I said, some people like to keep the binary image around so they don't have to re-download it every time. Now, once you've done that and we've copied and pasted the launch script, we want to verify that the pen test is actually running. So the way you're going to do that is go back into the console, and you're going to see that the op that you've just submitted is provisioning. So what provisioning means is that the command and control service in the cloud has been provisioned or is being provisioned. And that is a dedicated virtual private cloud instance that has all of the command and control services required for the op to execute. That status will go from provisioning to ready. That means the command and control service is ready to go. And once the C2 service is ready, NodeZero will detect the ready state, that client that you just downloaded, and it will shift the state to running, and NodeZero will start to receive commands from the command and control service. So the way that looks is NodeZero, you've now given it initial access. It has been able to connect to the command and control service. It is starting to receive commands into the NodeZero Docker container, and it'll start to execute those commands. And what it's going to do is act as an advanced persistent threat. It is going to orchestrate hundreds of different offensive tools and techniques. It is safe to run in production. So NodeZero is designed to be safe. We know what is dangerous to exploit and what is not dangerous to exploit. and is something we take a lot of care into understanding to make sure that running NodeZero does not make your day worse. As it executes, what NodeZero is going to do is enter this maneuver loop where it is going to start to discover every single device on the network. It will fingerprint every open host, port, and service. It will start to use various techniques to harvest credentials using tools like Responder to do man-in-the-middle hash collection as one example. It will, of the fingerprinted services it has discovered, try to exploit different vulnerabilities. It will try to identify dangerous product defaults and misconfigurations. But what's important is it's not trying to do any one of these things in isolation. Rather, it is trying to figure out how to chain and combine these different problems together in order to achieve an effect. And that effect is sensitive data closure or trying to disrupt business operations. And the way it does that is it is generating a knowledge graph as it executes the pen test. And that knowledge graph represents your cyber terrain. It represents all the hosts, ports, services, credentials that were harvested, interesting data that it's been able to discover and reach, and so on. As it builds out that knowledge graph, it is trying to find different attack vectors or paths through the graph that lead to an impact. What's important is that NodeZero in the reports will surface the attack path, proof of exploitation, and the impact for why this is important. And it does all of this with no persistent agents or no credentialed agents running in your environment. Now, if you go back to the console, what you're going to see are different types of reports. And you're going to see the provisioning state up here. It'll take 3 to 5 minutes, sometimes a little bit longer, in order to execute. So if you look at the output of a sample op, the first thing you're going to see when you come in is the summary of everything that's been done. We're going to come back to this. The most important tab that you have in the output is the impacts tab. There are two types of cybersecurity problems to deal with. Problems that are so urgent and important that you've got to cancel your lunch plans, cancel plans with your family, and solve that problem as fast as possible. Anything that is immediate and urgent that you must address right away is going to show up in the critical impacts tab. Things like NodeZero is able to find a way to compromise your domain. If you have a domain compromise, the attacker has keys to the kingdom. They can do anything they want. Steal your data, compromise your badge readers, destroy your cloud, anything they want. That is a really big deal. Domain user compromise. If NodeZero can, or if an attacker can get access to a domain user account, they can access any of the data, systems, and services that that domain user has access to, and so on and so forth. You can see the various critical impacts that we've identified. Now I talked about attack vectors. So let's look at domain compromise. We're able to compromise one domain 6 different ways. If you go back to the graph, what that means is we found an impact domain compromise 6 different paths in the graph in order to get there. When you view the technical details, you can see the different types of paths that we found. One was a net logon vulnerability that gave us direct access to the domain controller. Another one was we were able to grab the domain admin credential, AJ Smith, on that domain, and that's pretty interesting. Let's double click on that. And what you see here is the full attack path. So back to understanding, NodeZero was that initial access point that enabled the attacker to gain access to your network and conduct an operation. From NodeZero, 2 things occurred. The first is the module called Responder, which is doing man-in-the-middle attacks of your hashes that are being passed through DNS misconfigurations, was turned on. Here is proof of NodeZero turning on Responder. And here is proof of this username for this domain being collected. And this is the hash that Responder was able to collect. The next thing it did was take that potential credential, take the hash that it collected, and then it tried to crack that hash. If you have weak passwords, as an example, it will be very easy for an attacker to crack those hashes to get the clear text password. Here is proof of us taking the hash, using Hashcat, which is a well-known attacker tool, and cracking the password and seeing the password in clear text. Now, we will never actually persistently store this password. It is masked in our databases so that, once again, we don't make your day worse by enabling an attacker to use information from us to attack you. So it is stored as one asterisk asterisk asterisk. We don't actually persistently store the clear text password here. Now, separately, what NodeZero did was find the domain service. It then found the domain controller and identified that the domain controller was misconfigured with an SMB service that was running. Here is proof of us using AJ Smith with the password that we cracked to gain access to that SMB drive and enumerated the permissions. And here is proof that we were able to get domain administrator access through the AJ Smith credential. So what you have is full path, proof, and impact. So you know that this is a legitimate problem that you need to address as soon as possible. And we're able to provide that level of detail for a number of issues that we deem critical. In addition to owning you or trying to find ways to own you, we also want to help you measure your posture against known best practices. So we look at things like your asset inventory. We look at things around your secure configurations so that we don't want to just poke you in the eye and show the attack paths, but rather, how do you measure against known best practices so that you can prove to your boss that you're doing a good job? As you come into the product, you can see some of the other tabs, all of the weaknesses that we found, all of the credentials we were able to harvest using different techniques like credentialed stuffing, default login, and so on. All of the hosts we were able to discover, all of the data we were able to gain access to, including an understanding of what data we deem critical. For example, you can expand on this data. You can view the sensitive files. Now, we never actually look at the contents of the file. What we're looking for are known file types that are important. User-generated content like CSVs, PowerPoints, Word docs, MDB files for your email database, PowerPoint, zip files, web configs, AWS tokens, and secrets, and other information like that. All of the web apps we're able to find, including all of the certificates. So in addition to finding critical impacts and best practices, we've also surfaced all of the interesting artifacts so that you can use us as a starting point for any additional probing you would like to do from an attacker's perspective. So I'll leave you with that. If you look at the steps, what is NodeZero? Single-use Docker container. What does it require? It is a Docker host that requires a hypervisor running Linux and Docker, or a Linux box with Docker running on it, or Mac OS with Docker Desktop, keeping in mind there are limitations with Mac OS and Docker Desktop. Once you've got that, and you can shell access or open a shell on that Docker host, you want to be able to run a pen test, generate the NodeZero launch script, and from that launch script, copy and paste it into the shell so it can execute. At the end of the operation, everything cleans itself up. And as the op is running, you can verify that everything is behaving correctly. So if you go back to the ops page, you can see the op that I submitted. You can see that it has already identified one weakness. It has already enumerated 10 hosts. And if you would like, you can get a real-time view and see exactly what NodeZero is executing. So what are all of the running modules? What are the issues that have been discovered so far? What are the list of processes running on that Docker container? So you've got full transparency and visibility. What are all of the open network connections? So you can see that, once again, with full transparency. In case you need to deconflict and prove to the SOC that an issue that you're seeing is not due to NodeZero, you've got all the data right here. A history of all the commands that were executed. If you'd like to inject a credential, and this is a scenario where you would like to understand, what if a employee within my customer support team was compromised? Inject a known credential from the customer support team, and you can put it in. What if an insider threat with X number of privileges conducted an attack against us. You can put that privilege or that user ID password pair in here and submit it. And what that they'll do is NodeZero will take those credentials and use them to try to gain domain user access, try to understand what resources those credentials have access to. It will use that to try to find ways to elevate those privileges into domain administrator and so on. What's really important is those credentials are never persisted to disk. They are never stored in any way beyond the operation, because once again, we don't want you to have to store passwords in some config file or in some container. Those credentials are injected. They're only kept in memory. At the end of the pen test, the Docker container is destroyed, the virtual private cloud is destroyed, and any credentials you injected into the op are also destroyed with it. So you don't have the same security risk of a credentialed agent whose user IDs and passwords could be compromised and taken by an attacker. I hope this is helpful, and I'm looking forward to seeing you running some operations within the product. Thank you.